Welcome to English in Fluency. I'm your host, Alex, and today I want to start with something a little different. I want to ask you a question. Not a grammar question, not a vocabulary question. Just a simple, honest question. Have you ever been in a conversation in English, and suddenly you weren't sure if the other person was done talking? Like, they said something, and you waited, and then you started to speak, and then they started to speak again at the same time, and it was this awkward little moment where nobody knew whose turn it was? Yeah, that happens to a lot of people. And honestly, it's not because your English is bad. It's because nobody taught you this particular skill. Nobody sat you down and said, "Hey, let me show you how English speakers signal that they're wrapping up an idea." That's what we're doing today, right here, right now. So stay with me, because by the end of this lesson, you are going to hear English conversations in a completely different way. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're at a meeting. Your colleague, let's call her Sophie, has been explaining something to the group. She's been talking for a while, going through all the details. And then she says something like, "So, basically, that's the main thing we need to keep in mind going forward." And the room gets quiet. Everyone nods. Someone else starts talking. You didn't see any hand signals. Nobody said, "I'm finished now." But somehow, everyone in the room knew Sophie was done. How? That's the magic we're going to unpack today. There are specific words, specific phrases, specific changes in the way people speak that tell you, loud and clear, that an idea is coming to a close. And once you learn to recognize them, listening to English becomes so much easier, so much clearer. Almost like someone turned up the volume on a radio that was always a little fuzzy before. Today's lesson is built for B1 level learners. So if you're somewhere in the middle of your English journey, if you understand a good amount, but still sometimes feel lost during real conversations, this is exactly where you need to be. We're going to work through this together, slowly and carefully, with lots of examples and lots of practice. I'm not going to rush you. We're going to take our time and really let these ideas sink in. And here's my promise to you. By the time we're done today, you will feel more confident listening to English. Not just a little more confident. A lot more confident. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about what it actually means when a speaker signals that they're finishing an idea. Think of it this way. When you're reading a book, you know a sentence is over because you see a period. You know a paragraph is ending because there's a gap before the next one. But in spoken English, there are no visible periods or gaps. Instead, speakers use what we call conclusion signals. These are little tools, words, phrases, changes in tone, that work like punctuation marks. They tell the listener, "Okay, this part is wrapping up," and they are everywhere. Once you start noticing them, you will hear them in almost every conversation, every video, every podcast in English. Let me introduce you to the first and probably most common group of conclusion signals. These are what I like to call summary phrases. These are phrases that a speaker uses to gather everything they've said and present it one final time before moving on. Listen to this. Imagine your friend Marcus has been telling you about a movie he watched last night. He's been describing the plot, the actors, the special effects. And then he says, "So, in summary, it was a really great film and I think you'd love it." Did you catch it? In summary. That phrase is like a flare gun going off. It's a signal that says everything before this was the buildup. And now I'm giving you the final version, the short version, the version I want you to walk away remembering. Other phrases that work exactly the same way include to summarize, to sum up, in short, in brief, and to put it simply. All of them do the same job. They gather the ideas that came before and present them in a compact final form. Now here's something really useful to know. When you hear one of these phrases in a listening exercise or in a real conversation, that's your moment to pay very close attention. Because what comes after a summary phrase is usually the most important information in the whole section. The speaker is essentially handing you their main point on a silver platter. So instead of trying to understand every single word that was said before, if you catch the summary phrase and then focus hard on what comes right after it, you will almost always understand the key idea. This is one of the best listening strategies I can give you. It works in academic lectures, it works in business meetings, it works in casual conversations. Train yourself to listen for these phrases, and your comprehension will jump up immediately. Let's practice this right now. I'm going to describe a situation, and I want you to listen for the summary phrase. Ready? Here we go. The new coffee shop on the corner has really good food. The service is friendly, the prices are reasonable, and there's always somewhere to sit. To sum up, it's a great place to spend an afternoon. Okay. What was the summary phrase? It was to sum up. And what came after it? It's a great place to spend an afternoon. That's the main point. That's what the speaker wants you to remember. Everything before was supporting detail. The summary phrase was the signal that said, "Here it comes," the main idea. Good. Let's keep going. The second group of conclusion signals I want to talk about are what I call result phrases. These are phrases that show you the speaker is about to tell you the outcome of everything they've discussed. In other words, they're about to tell you what happened, or what should happen, or what the logical endpoint is. Listen for phrases like, as a result, therefore, consequently. This means that, so the outcome is, and that's why. These words and phrases connect cause and effect. They say, here's what happened, and because of that, here is the result. Let me give you an example. Imagine your neighbor, let's call him Daniel, is explaining why he decided to buy a new car. He says, the old one kept breaking down, the repairs were getting really expensive, and honestly, I was spending more time at the mechanic than I was actually driving. As a result, I decided it made more sense to just buy something new. There it is. As a result. That's the signal. Everything before was the cause, the problems with the old car. Everything after is the result. Buying a new car. The conclusion signal told you exactly where you were in the story. This kind of signal is incredibly common in academic English, in news reports, in explanations of any kind. Think about the last time you heard a teacher or a professor explain something. They probably said something like, the experiment showed that the temperature was too high, the reaction happened too quickly, and the results were unstable. Therefore, we can conclude that lower temperatures produce more reliable outcomes. Therefore is the signal. The conclusion is coming. Get ready for it. If you can train your ear to catch these result phrases, you will find academic listening so much easier because academic speaking is full of them. Speakers in lectures and presentations use result phrases constantly to show the logical flow of their ideas. Let me give you another practice example. Listen carefully. The team worked extra hours all week. They communicated really well, and they stayed focused on the deadline. Consequently, the project was delivered 2 days early. What's the signal? Consequently. What's the result? The project was delivered early. The signal told you? Cause is finished. Result is coming. Beautiful. Let's move on. The third group is one of my personal favorites, and I think it's going to really help you in everyday conversations especially. These are what I call closing expressions. These are short, almost automatic phrases that speakers use right at the very end of an idea, just before they stop talking, or before they hand the conversation over to someone else. These include phrases like, anyway, at the end of the day, when all is said and done. The bottom line is, the point is, the thing is, and simply, so, yeah. I know. Some of these sound very casual, very informal, and they are. But that's exactly why they're so important for B1 learners to know, because a lot of the English you encounter in real life, in videos, in movies, in conversations with native speakers, is informal English. And if you only know formal conclusion signals, you're going to miss half the signals people actually use. Let me show you how these work. Imagine you're talking to your coworker. Let's call her Priya. She's been telling you about a long, complicated situation with her landlord. She's told you the whole story. And then she says, anyway, I've already decided to just look for a new flat. That word anyway is a beautiful, efficient little conclusion signal. It says, I've been giving you all this context and detail, but now let me land this and move on. When you hear anyway in the middle of a story, it means the storyteller is wrapping up and getting to the point, or getting ready to move on to something else. It's like a gentle gear shift. At the end of the day is another powerful one. When someone says, at the end of the day, they mean putting everything else aside. Here is what really matters. It's a way of saying, I've told you all the complicated stuff, but here's the simple truth underneath it all. Like this. We tried different approaches. We had long meetings. We went back and forth on it for weeks. At the end of the day, we just had to make a decision and commit to it. The signal at the end of the day tells you, the complicated part is over. Here's the simple core truth. Hear that signal, and you know the most important, most distilled idea is coming right up. The bottom line works in a very similar way, but it's a little more direct, a little more business-like. Imagine your friend Leo has been explaining his finances to you, his rent, his expenses, his income, all of it. And then he says, the bottom line is, I can't afford to go on holiday this year. That's the conclusion. The bottom line. Everything before was background. The signal told you, here comes the final, most essential truth. These phrases are so common in everyday English, and recognizing them will make a huge difference to how well you follow conversations. All right, let's pause here for a moment and do something a little bit different. I want you to imagine you're listening to a podcast, in English, of course, and the host is talking about social media and mental health. She's been going on about different studies, different opinions, different experiences. Listen to this paragraph and see if you can catch the conclusion signals. Ready? Different research has shown different things. Some studies say social media increases anxiety. Others say it depends on how you use it. Some people report feeling more connected, others feel more isolated. At the end of the day, the relationship between social media and mental health is personal. But the bottom line is, being mindful of how much time you spend online is probably a good idea for most people. How many conclusion signals did you catch? There were 2. At the end of the day was the first one. It gathered all the contradictory information and gave you a distilled truth. The relationship is personal. Then, the bottom line came in to give you the final, practical takeaway. Be mindful of your screen time. 2 signals, 2 conclusions. Did you get them both? Give yourself a pat on the back if you did. And if you missed them, that's completely fine. That's exactly why we're doing this together. Now I want to talk about something that's a little more subtle but really powerful, and that's the idea of conclusion signals that don't use special words at all. These are what we call prosodic signals, signals that come from the way a person's voice sounds rather than from the specific words they choose. I know that word prosodic sounds very technical, so let me just explain it simply. Prosody is basically the music of speech, the rhythm, the speed, the pitch, the volume. And when English speakers are finishing an idea, they often change this music in very specific ways. Their voice gets a little lower. Their pace slows down. They might stretch out the last word slightly. And very often, they take a breath right after, which creates a small but noticeable pause. Think about the last time someone told you a story. Maybe they were telling you about something funny that happened. They built up the story, added the details, and then right at the punchline, their voice shifted. It got a bit softer, maybe a little slower, to really land the ending. That shift is a prosodic signal. It tells your brain, we've arrived. This is the conclusion. Even without the words, your brain picked it up, right? That's because humans are actually very good at reading these vocal signals. The problem is, when you're listening in a second language, you're spending so much mental energy trying to understand the words that you stop noticing the music. Today, we're trying to bring that awareness back. So how do you actually practice noticing prosodic signals? One of the best ways is to watch English videos with the sound on and the subtitles off. I know, that sounds scary. But don't try to understand every word at first. Instead, just listen to the rhythm and the melody of the voice. Try to notice when the speaker's voice drops, when they slow down, when there's a pause. Those are often conclusion moments. You don't need to understand everything that was said to notice when the speaker is landing their point. Once you start tuning into the rhythm rather than the words, you'll find you understand the structure of what's being said, even when you miss some of the vocabulary. Another really effective technique is to shadow English speakers. Shadowing means you listen to someone speaking, and you repeat what they say at the same time, trying to match their speed, their tone, their rhythm. When you shadow, you start to feel conclusion signals in your own voice and body, not just hear them in someone else's. Your voice naturally drops when you're finishing an idea, because that's how English works. And when you've practiced that enough times, you start to recognize it instantly when other people do it too. Shadowing is one of the most underrated English learning techniques out there, and I really encourage you to try it. Okay, let's shift gears a little and talk about some more specific conclusion phrases that are really common in structured speech. Things like presentations, lectures, and formal explanations. These are important if you're studying English for academic purposes, or if you work in an environment where people give presentations or reports. In these contexts, speakers often use very explicit, very clear conclusion signals because they want to make absolutely sure the audience follows the structure of what they're saying. These phrases include things like to conclude, in conclusion, to wrap up. Let me finish by saying, my final point is, before I close, and I'd like to end by. These are like neon signs. They're impossible to miss if you know what to look for. And the beautiful thing is, once a speaker says one of these phrases, you know with absolute certainty that the most important takeaway is coming in the next few sentences. Let me walk you through an example. Imagine a professor named Dr. Hartley is giving a lecture about climate change. She's been talking for 45 minutes. You've been listening as hard as you can. Your brain is a little tired. And then she says, to conclude, the most urgent action we can take as individuals is to reduce our consumption of single-use plastics and to advocate for policy changes in our communities. To conclude is the signal. And look what comes after it. A clear, direct statement of the most important thing she wants her students to remember. If you caught that signal and focused on those two sentences, you got the essential message of the entire lecture. That's how powerful conclusion signals are. They help you work smarter, not harder, when you're listening to long, complex pieces of English. And it's not just to conclude and in conclusion. Let's talk about my final point is for a second, because this one is particularly useful. When a speaker says, my final point is, they're not just signaling a conclusion. They're also telling you exactly how many ideas they've shared. If they say, my final point, you know there were several points before it, and now you're at the last one. This helps you organize what you've heard in your mind. You can mentally say, okay, I've heard all the supporting arguments. Now here's the last one, and after this, they'll probably wrap up the whole thing. That mental map makes it so much easier to remember what you've heard. Let me give you a full practice paragraph with multiple conclusion signals at different levels. Listen carefully and try to catch them all. I'll speak slowly so you have time to notice. The research team spent 3 years studying sleep patterns in teenagers. They found that most teenagers were not getting enough sleep on school nights. They found that screen time before bed was a significant contributing factor. They also found that early school start times made things worse. Therefore, the researchers concluded that a combination of later school start times and screen-free bedtime routines could significantly improve teenage health and academic performance. In conclusion, the study suggests that small changes to daily routines can have a big impact on teenagers' well-being. The bottom line is, if we want healthier, happier teenagers, we need to let them sleep. Okay, let's go through that. Therefore was the first signal. It introduced the result of the research. In conclusion was the second. It gave a summary of what the research suggests. The bottom line was the third. It gave the final, simplified takeaway. 3 signals, 3 levels of conclusion. That's a very typical structure in academic and informational English, and now you know how to navigate it. I want to take a moment now to talk about something that trips up a lot of learners, and that's the difference between a conclusion signal and a transition signal. These are different things, and it's important to know the difference. A transition signal tells you the speaker is moving from one idea to the next, but they're not done with the topic yet. A conclusion signal tells you they're wrapping up, either the whole thing or at least this major section. So, for example, however, on the other hand, in addition, furthermore, also, these are transition words. They keep the ideas flowing. They say, we're still going. Whereas, in summary, therefore, to conclude, at the end of the day, these are conclusion words. They say, we're landing. Knowing this distinction will help you follow the structure of a speech or conversation much more accurately, because you won't think something is ending when it's just moving to the next point. Here's a helpful little test you can apply when you hear a signal word. Ask yourself, does this word feel like a turn? Like the speaker is moving sideways to a new idea? Or does it feel like a landing? Like the speaker is coming down to earth and finishing? If it feels like a landing, it's probably a conclusion signal. If it feels like a turn, it's probably a transition. With practice, this becomes automatic. Your brain starts to feel the difference without you having to consciously think about it. Now, let me teach you something that I find really fascinating. A lot of native English speakers use what I call mini-conclusions in the middle of their speech. This is when they briefly wrap up one sub-idea before moving on to the next one. For example, someone might be giving 3 reasons why they like a city. After explaining the first reason, they'll say something like, "So yeah, the food scene there is just incredible." That "so yeah" is a mini-conclusion for that point. It signals, I'm done with this part, now let me move to the next one. And then, after the second reason, they might say, anyway, as I was saying, the architecture is also really stunning. That anyway is another mini-conclusion, and so on. When you notice these mini-conclusions, you realize the speaker is much more organized than they might sound to someone who doesn't know what to listen for. They're actually signaling the structure of their speech in real time, and once you can hear those signals, you can follow that structure effortlessly. Let's do a longer practice exercise now. I'm going to tell you a story in the voice of a character named James, and your job is to listen for every conclusion signal, whether it's a big one or a mini-conclusion. I'll go at a natural, but not too fast pace. Here we go. Okay, so last year I decided I wanted to learn how to cook properly. I'd been living alone for about 2 years at that point, and honestly my diet was terrible. I was eating ready meals, ordering takeaway way too often, and basically surviving on toast and cereal. So yeah, I knew something had to change. I started watching a lot of cooking videos online. I tried simple recipes at first. Pasta, stir-fry, things like that. I made a lot of mistakes. I burned things. I oversalted things. I once set off the smoke alarm 3 times in 1 week. But I kept going. To cut a long story short, after about 6 months, I was actually pretty comfortable in the kitchen. I could cook a decent meal from scratch without looking at a recipe. As a result, my whole relationship with food changed. I started enjoying meals more. I felt healthier. I was spending less money. At the end of the day, learning to cook was one of the best things I did for myself. The bottom line is, it's a life skill that I really wish someone had taught me earlier. Okay, how many did you get? Let's count them. So, yeah, after describing the bad diet was the first mini-conclusion. Then, to cut a long story short, was the signal that James was skipping forward to the outcome. As a result, introduced the effects of learning to cook. At the end of the day, gave the overall life lesson. And the bottom line was the final most essential takeaway. 5 conclusion signals in one short story. And notice how each one moved the story forward and helped you understand where you were in James's experience. Without those signals, the story would feel like a jumble of details. With them, it has a clear shape and direction. Let's talk about one more category of conclusion signals before we move into our final practice section. And this category is question-based conclusions. Yes, sometimes speakers signal that they're wrapping up by asking a question, usually a rhetorical question, which means a question that doesn't really expect an answer. It's more like a dramatic way of making a point. You'll hear things like, "So what does all this mean?" Or, "So where does that leave us?" Or, "So what's the takeaway here?" Or, "And the question is, what do we do with all this information?" These questions aren't really questions. They're signals. They're saying, "I've given you a lot, and now let me tell you what it all adds up to." The answer to these rhetorical questions is always the conclusion. So when you hear one of these, lean in. The important part is about to happen. Here's an example. Imagine a journalist named Claudia is being interviewed on a podcast. She's been talking about income inequality for several minutes. And then the interviewer asks her a question. And she responds, "Yeah, and I think that's the crucial issue, isn't it? So what does all of this mean for ordinary people?" It means that without serious policy intervention, the gap between the richest and the rest is only going to grow. And that has real consequences for social stability, for mental health, for everything. Did you hear it? So what does all of this mean? Was the rhetorical question. The conclusion signal. And what came right after was the conclusion. Without policy intervention, the gap will grow, and consequences will follow. That's the point Claudia wanted to make. The rhetorical question was the door, and the conclusion walked right through it. And here's a fun thing to try. Next time you're watching an English interview or a TED Talk or a documentary, count the rhetorical questions the speakers use. You'll be surprised how many there are. They're a staple of English language speaking, especially when someone is trying to explain something complex to a general audience. And every single one of them is a signal that says, the conclusion is right here. We're getting close to the end of our lesson now, and I want to give you a big final practice exercise. This one is going to put everything together. I'm going to give you a longer talk about a fictional person named Natalie and her experience moving to a new country. As you listen, I want you to notice every conclusion signal. Summary phrases, result phrases, closing expressions, rhetorical questions, and any mini-conclusions along the way. Ready? Let's go. Moving to a new country is one of the hardest things a person can do. Natalie knew this intellectually before she made the move, but knowing something in your head and actually experiencing it are very different things. When she arrived in her new city, she felt excited and terrified at the same time. She didn't know anyone. She struggled with the accent. She found the supermarket confusing because all the brands were different. She felt homesick in a way she hadn't expected. So, in short, the first few months were genuinely difficult. But Natalie didn't give up. She joined a local language class, even though her language skills were already decent. She figured it was a good way to meet people. She volunteered at a community center on weekends. She started a small blog about her experience of adapting to a new culture. As a result, things started to shift. Slowly but surely, she began to feel less like a stranger. She made friends. She learned which shops she liked, which cafes felt like hers, which parks she loved to walk in. To sum up, she started building a life. Now, was it easy? No. Did she still have hard days? Days when she missed home so much it hurt? Absolutely. But here's the thing. Natalie herself will tell you that those hard days were part of the process. They weren't signs that she'd made a mistake. They were signs that she was growing. And so, what's the takeaway from Natalie's story? The bottom line is this. Adaptation takes time, and that's not a weakness. That's just what it means to be human in a new place. At the end of the day, the discomfort of adjustment is temporary, but the strength you build from going through it, that stays with you forever. Beautiful. Let's go through the conclusion signals in that story. In short, the first few months were genuinely difficult. That was the first one, wrapping up the description of the hard beginning. As a result, things started to shift. Result phrase, showing the outcome of Natalie's efforts. To sum up, she started building a life. Summary phrase, gathering everything into a simple conclusion. Now, was it easy? No. That rhetorical question was a mini-conclusion signal, landing the point that it wasn't easy. And so, what's the takeaway from Natalie's story? Another rhetorical question, signaling that the big final conclusion is coming. The bottom line is this. There's the conclusion signal. At the end of the day, one more, giving the deepest, most lasting message of the whole story. 7 signals in one story, and each one helped you follow the emotional and narrative arc. Each one helped you know where you were, what had been established, and what was still to come. I want to leave you with a few practical things you can do starting today to build this skill. First, whenever you watch or listen to English content, give yourself one specific job. Just listen for conclusion signals. Don't worry about understanding everything. Just hunt for the signals. Write down each one you catch and what came right after it. You'll start to see patterns very quickly. Second, try to use these signals yourself when you speak English. When you're explaining something and you're about to make your main point, say, to sum up, or the bottom line is, or at the end of the day. Using these phrases in your own speech will help you recognize them faster when other people use them. Third, practice with podcasts or news programs. These are great sources because the speakers are well organized and use clear conclusion signals regularly. Start with slower, more deliberate speakers and work your way up to natural conversational speed. And here's one last thing I want you to carry with you from today's lesson. Listening comprehension is not about understanding every word. It's about understanding the structure. When you know the structure, when you can hear where ideas begin and where they end, when you can spot the main point as it arrives, you don't need to understand every single word to follow what's being said. The conclusion signals are the skeleton of spoken English. Learn to see that skeleton, and the rest of the body starts to make sense. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today here on English in Fluency. I'm Alex, and I genuinely hope this lesson has changed the way you listen to English. If it has, if you had one of those moments where something clicked and you thought, "Oh, I've been missing that all along." Then share this with a friend who's learning English too. Let them have that moment as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we have so many more lessons exactly like this one coming your way. Leave a comment below and tell me, which conclusion signal was new to you today? Which one surprised you? I read every single comment, and I love hearing from you. You're not just watching a video. You're part of a community of learners who are all growing together. So yeah, and yes, that was a conclusion signal to sum up what we covered today. We talked about summary phrases like "in summary," "to sum up," and "in short." We explored result phrases like "as a result," "therefore," and "consequently." We looked at closing expressions like "at the end of the day," "the bottom line is," and "anyway." We discovered prosodic signals, the music of conclusion in someone's voice. We talked about rhetorical questions as conclusion signals, and we practiced with stories, examples, and full paragraphs. You've done a lot of work today. Be proud of that. The bottom line is, you are getting better at English. Every lesson, every hour of practice, every moment of focused listening is adding up. Keep going. I'll see you in the next lesson. Take care.